According to experts, children start asking the question why somewhere between the age of 2 and 5, pretty much when they start to develop a language. And kids can ask questions of any kind. Oh, they can average sometimes 100 questions a day kids can ask. And the earliest questions are usually fact questions, vocabulary, or what is that kind of questions. But statistically, research says that by age 4, most are questions seeking some kind of explanation. Why questions? Just trying to get to some understanding of how the world works. It makes a lot of sense. I saw a New Yorker magazine cartoon many years ago. I don't know if there's a bunch of New Yorker magazines. It's the one that has all the cartoons in it. And in it was a series of cartoons where a child was asking why, and it was entitled The Tunnel of Whys. The Tunnel of Whys. And some of you are familiar with that if you've had children. By middle school, interestingly enough, they don't ask questions anymore. In fact, Bob and I taught elementary school, and I taught 5th and 6th grade, and halfway through 6th grade, they not only don't ask why anymore questions, but they're no longer interested in anything. And after Christmas break, they're more interested in giving you answers. No, you can't make me do that kind of stuff. It was always painful after Christmas in 6th grade to find out that the kids come back as 7th graders already. But if you've ever been on the answering side of one of those tunnel of whys, you know that sometimes it ends with because, just because, that's why. Now go outside and play. And on the other hand, sometimes you just come up with an answer. My middle son, Andy, had a question which wasn't strictly why question, but he wanted to know who made God, and he wouldn't let go of it. And he came back time after time with he wanted to know who made God. And finally I just said to him, I said, Andy, all right, I didn't want to tell you. Do you want to know who made God? It was Bob. His name was Bob, and I'm not telling you who made Bob. It wasn't a satisfying answer, but it stopped him, that's for sure. He wasn't going to get any more of an answer than that. Or in the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, there's a scene in which Calvin, the little boy, comes up to his father, who's looking at a bunch of old pictures, black and white pictures. And Calvin wants to know why these pictures were black and white. And his father, who always lied to him, said, because actually the whole world was black and white, right up into 1952. And it's in 1952 the whole world turned color. And so after that, all the pictures are in color. You can give those kinds of answers. As children, they do ask lots of why questions that can kind of drive us crazy. But we become adults, but we still have the tunnel of whys. It's just that the why questions are just a little more complicated. Like, why does so-and-so act like that? Why can't people just get along? Or why has this happened to me? Why can't the fighting just end? Why did that hurricane or that tornado hit us? Adam Hamilton, who I think you've studied some of his writings and books over the years, I wrote a book, it was just entitled Why? And in it he put the big ones, like, why do the innocent suffer? Why do my prayers go unanswered? Why can't I see God's will for my life? After any national or international tragedy, I think we all find ourselves asking why. When the former president was shot a few weeks ago, I always have slightly different questions before I get to the why question. Frankly, one of the questions I want to know is how old is the guy? And it's always, I know there was one shooting, I think, and when there was a woman who did it, but it's always a guy. And it's always a guy between the ages of, say, 18 and about 25, 26 years old. And it's usually an automatic weapon. And there's some theories that if you could just ban the sale or distribution of automatic weapons to males between the age of 18 and 25, 26 years old, you might be able to stop a lot of the craziness, because it seems like men start to work out their stuff somehow after that. But then we always get to the why question. Why did the guy do it? Why did it happen? It's a human condition, asking why. We ask as if there might be some kind of satisfactory explanation that we would say, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. I can understand how that would happen. But it never usually happens like that. Part of it's rooted in the fact that we want to blame somebody, and our need to blame someone or something, of course, goes all the way back to Eden in the very first chapters of the Bible, where they've eaten from the tree they weren't supposed to, and God confronts them and wants to basically know why they did it, and Adam says, that woman that you gave me made me do it. We know how to do blame. It's easy. The Bible's filled with why questions too. It's not just us. God asked them in Exodus, why are you crying to me? And then in Isaiah, why do you complain so much? Or in the Bible we find questions like the one in the Psalm that we read this morning, or from Psalm 10, why, O Lord, do you stand far off? There's a lot of questions about why do you seem so distant, God? Jesus asks a lot of questions too, of course. Why do you worry? Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye and not the log in your own? Or why are you afraid? He asks lots of questions to draw us closer to him. It's pretty much one of those situations that Jesus runs into today in our text. It's one in which he and the disciples meet a man who's born blind. It's not the first time they met a guy born blind, but on this particular occasion, the disciples apparently want to know, why was he blind? Figure there's some explanation. And they have an explanation. They say, who sinned? Somebody sinned, obviously, that's why he's born blind, his man or his parents. And Jesus says, neither. This happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life, so that the power of God could be shown. Eugene Peterson translates it this way. Jesus said, you're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There is no cause and effect here. Look instead for what God can do. And then Jesus heals the man. And word begins to spread, and the neighbors take the man to the Pharisees eventually, and then the questions are unbelievable. This afternoon, go ahead and read the rest of that chapter. It's just a fascinating effort at conspiracy work, I suppose. Two things we need to admit, I think, when we come up with why questions. One is that they rarely do have a satisfying answer. Sometimes we ask why, and any answer that we come up with usually leaves us like children, still in that tunnel of whys. That's why I say this whole sermon may be unsatisfactory, because that's the nature of asking that very question. Often in our desperation to know why, we can find ourselves making up answers. We make up answers. Why did this happen? It happened because of punishment for their sin. It hasn't happened because the person didn't have enough faith. There wasn't enough faith, or it must be God's will. For the blind man, those Pharisees, the teachers of the law, desperately wanted an explanation. So they start to interrogate everybody, and they come up with a wonderful explanation. Every single person is lying, obviously. It's a conspiracy. And they first deny that anything really happened, and then begin to wonder, no, how technically did it happen? And in this case, as we read in the passage, Jesus spits in the ground, he takes some mud and some kind of, and puts it on his eyes, and then he begins to see. And so the Pharisees are pretty sure it's some kind of magical trick kind of thing. And then the fact that he did it on the Sabbath, obviously it couldn't be of God, because everybody knows God doesn't do anything on Sundays. But there is another thing about why questions we need to admit. And that is that they often become religious questions. People who have nothing to do with God, have no interest in God, immediately want to know why God would allow such a thing, or why did God do such a thing? A personal problem seems hopeless, and we wonder, why doesn't God help me? A world problem, and there's plenty of them, about peace, why doesn't God do something? There's a shooting, why did God allow this to happen? Why questions make us try to search the mysteries of God, and many times those mysteries are just that. We are not God, and sometimes we just have to live with such questions. So I wanted to leave you with two ideas, because inevitably there'll be another shooting. Inevitably there'll be, I was going to say another conflict, there will just continue to be more conflicts. Eventually you will ask yourself a personal question, why, from time to time, as we all have. What do we do with that question, why? Well, let me just leave you with two things today. One is, while there are no simple explanations that are going to satisfy us, there are some simple truths that will not fully satisfy, but can be helpful, can at least help us to just move forward when we ask those why questions. In the first church I was in, I was 25 years old, and I always say I don't think anybody church should allow somebody 25 years old to be their pastor now, but they did, and they were a wonderful congregation, and they taught me a lot. Early on, I had an opportunity to go visit a new part of the congregation. Actually, she was the mother of one of my members. She was in her 90s. Her name was Mary DiDomenica. And she lived a marvelous life. I'm a Baptist, and this might be hard to believe, but there was a huge Italian Baptist convention, especially on the East Coast years ago. And there were a lot of Italians who were Baptists, and it was an amazing thing. And so she was always involved with her husband in church. Her husband had passed away. She's now in her 90s. She now can't take care of herself the way she used to. And her daughter said, "Mom, you've got to come live with me. Live with me. You can't be on your own anymore." And that's when I met Mary DiDomenica. Her adult daughter brought her to church one Sunday, and I said, "Mary, I got to come visit you." And she said, "I'd like that." It hadn't been that long that she'd been in her daughter's house, and she was still coming to grips with all the things that she was losing. And so here I am, 25 years old, sitting across from Mary DiDomenica, hearing her story about her life. But she got down to business pretty quick. She wanted to know, why is God keeping me here? And I was 25 years old, and I hadn't learned yet that the answer to that question is simply just listen. But I was 25 years old, and I knew I had to come up with an answer for everything. And so you'll appreciate this, being Presbyterian. I said, "Mary, in the Presbyterian church, there's a Westminster Catechism. And the very first question is, what is the chief end of people, of humans, of man?" And I said, the answer is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. And that doesn't require driving. It doesn't require going and leading some meeting or starting some organization. It doesn't mean doing this and doing that. In fact, it's simply being. That you have tremendous value to God, not in tasks that you are going to accomplish, but in being the woman of faith that you've been all these years, and the opportunity to glorify God, enjoy Him forever, is a witness to all this. And it wasn't satisfying, but it was a little bit of an answer that she could hold on to as she kept living year after year after that. The Apostle Paul asked that question. He wants to know, he asked an interesting question, a why question. He says, why is it that I have no control over my life. Romans chapter 7, he says, I know what I shouldn't be doing, and that's what I do. I know what I should be doing, I don't do that. I don't know why I do what I shouldn't do. And there's no explanation for it except for the sin that's living in me. You know, that is a little bit of an answer. That many of the things happen in this world, as Jesus said, in this world you'll have tribulation. He said, we live in a world that's marked by sin from the very, very beginning. That we're sinful people by nature, as Paul would say. And we do stuff. People hurt people. Whole nations of people hurt people. Small groups of people hurt people. Part of the reason, part of the small answers to why is it's because of who we are. Satisfying? Not at all. Because we can be better. But it's a little bit of an answer. Another little bit of a truth that we know is that in life there are so many mysteries of God still there. In life we can only glance at the mysteries. We only see one side of the mysteries. That there are things that we will never be able to explain because we are not God. The blind man finally says to his interrogators, all I know is this. I was blind, but now I see. That truth, that aspect, that he realized he couldn't explain all the mysteries of what had just happened and what God had done in his life. But he could know that he was blind and now he sees, and he knew that part of the mystery. I told you no answer was going to be satisfying, and but they can sometimes at least help us to move forward. The second thing I wanted to leave you with was from the text. One of the ways that what we can do with these why questions that we have is to start to look for the work of God being displayed. What can you learn? Well, what good can come out of this? A Romans 8:28 kind of thing. He says in the text that Jesus would say that they needed to look for what God could do, not that they did some kind of act of suffering or hardship or something that caused us to ask why. But in the midst of it, we can look for the work of God. All of us went through an amazing thing a few years ago when we went through the COVID worldwide pandemic. I suppose I was telling young people at that particular time, there's going to come a time when you grow up as an adult, you're going to be a grandparent maybe, and your grandchildren are going to say, Grandpa, Granny, do you remember the COVID? And we'll all remember. Those of us here remember everything we went through. When we were going through it, it was an interesting historical facts that started to come out. And one of them was kind of an interesting one from the 1700s. You see, smallpox was rampant in Boston in the early 1700s. People were just here settling, and it was still a British colony, of course, but Boston was a huge city, and smallpox was killing people day after day after day in the streets. It was a terrible situation in the city, and everyone was asking why. Why was this happening, and why was this happening? And Cotton Mather was a pastor in Boston at that particular time, and he had a slave, a servant in his house from Africa, and he had the presence of mind, Cotton Mather, to ask him if this ever happened in Africa. And his slave said, no, it doesn't happen in Africa, because in Africa, when you're a small child, they scratch your arm, and then they put some of the smallpox pus on your arm. And then you get a little sick, but you never actually catch the illness. You never die from the illness. And Cotton Mather realizes in this terrible situation in Boston, where everyone was asking, why was this happening? And what can happen? What can we do about it? Mather realized there was something that could be done. And at the time, ministers also always had a little side hustle in science. They were always kind of exploring science, whether it was agriculture or astronomy or even medical health and those kinds of things. And so, even though there was a tsunami of fear in the city, he looked for a doctor who would actually try to understand this thing that he'd been told. And he finally found one. Zabiel Boylston. Boylston's still a very big name in Boston on the streets and town and all. And Dr. Boylston was willing to test it. And they tested it on 200 candidates. They started with their own children and family first. And they had tremendous success. None of these people were starting to get smallpox when everybody else was seemingly catching it. But many people thought, that is the most ridiculous thing you could possibly do, is to put a life-killing disease on your arm? That made no sense at all. The medical community went to the public and declared Mather and Boylston to be dangerous people, along with their method, and scared people like crazy. And religious leaders came up with an answer, because we do that sometimes with why questions, and they declared that it was the will of God for people to die of smallpox, and if you were going to try to do something to stop that, then you were contradicting and fighting the very will of God, intervening in God's divine intervention of what he was trying to do. Ben Franklin, his brother, published a little magazine. Before social media, he printed tracts. He was a printer, and so he decided to attack Cotton Mather personally, because, this was the Cotton Mather who was involved in the Salem witch trials. And so he started saying, how could anything good come from this guy who was involved in the Salem witch trial? But eventually, the public anxiety eased. People started to notice that people who'd been inoculated were not catching the disease. At one point, eventually, in the state of Massachusetts, they would mandate smallpox vaccinations for all people. And the ministers finally agreed. You know, a God-given cure might also be the will of God. If God was willing to give us a solution to a problem, why would that be the will of God? And why would killing people be the will of God and not the solution? And so they began to turn around, and eventually Edward Jenner would develop a widely accepted vaccine for smallpox. You see, at first, the religious community jumped at the deeply unsatisfying but quick answer. God just wanted those people dead. That's why they're dying. Cotton Mathers and others decided they need to look for the work of God being displayed. We should not be afraid to ask why questions in life. And we must also realize that they ultimately lead us to God and the great mysteries of this wonderful life that he's given to us. Let's pray. Lord, it's hard to go very long in life without starting to ask why questions, not just when we're children, but certainly when we're adults. And sometimes those why questions even become very, very personal when we think about things that we're experiencing in our own lives. We understand that we may never have a good answer for a why question. But we thank you for the simple truths that you give us to move forward. We thank you, God, that one of those truths is always that you haven't abandoned the situation. You're still at work. You're still doing things, and that we need to look for those things that you're doing in the midst of them. So be patient, God, with us when we ask why.